Good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for today's event. My name is David Leviev. I'm a campus advisor for Camera on Campus and one of the panelists for tonight's event. I'm so excited to be able to help share the stories along with my co-panelists of three great communities that are a part of the broader Jewish tent and Jewish community. But before we get started, I just want to remind everybody watching on Facebook Live and here on Zoom that we are in webinar format. So you can participate in our event by submitting questions and comments through our Q&A function on Zoom and through our Facebook Live comment section on Facebook. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the event, even before Q&A starts. Now, to help introduce our event and begin our event panel, we have three important and amazing communities that are going to be represented by amazing panelists tonight. We'll be representing the Persian Jewish community, the Bukharian Jewish community, and the Kavkazi Mountain Jewish community. The reason we're bringing these three communities together today is because we believe it's important to share the broader Sephardic and Mizrahi story and the connection to the land of Israel and the state of Israel. In particular, we're just a few days away from Yom Yerushalayim, and we want to also talk about our community's connections to Jerusalem and the importance of Jerusalem to our communities and to the Jewish people as a whole. The reason these three communities specifically are connected is because both Bukharian and Kavkazi Jewish communities trace their roots to the Persian Jewish community after leaving the land of Israel. So the three communities have much in common and also some things that are different as well, as they all lived in different parts of the diaspora. So I'm very excited that you're all joining us. And I'm very excited to have our two other panelists here. So we have Manashe Khaimov, who represent the Bukharian community, and Janfar, our camera fellow at Binghamton University in New York State, who will help represent the Persian Jewish community, and I'll represent the Kavkazi community. To start off our event, we will all have 5-minute periods in which we could talk about our communities, introduce ourselves as individuals and our family story. Eden will begin this for us and share his story and the Persian Jewish story.
What's up, guys? Thanks to all who are joining now in this great event. And so I just want to introduce myself. My name is Janfar. I'm a camera fellow at Binghamton University. I come from Great Neck, New York. That is where I grew up. That is in New York on Long Island. And so both my parents are Persian. They were both born in Iran. They were raised in Iran. My dad moved to France when he was around 20 to study college, and then both of them, they both came to the US. And that's when they both met here. And so once coming here, they spoke to all their Persian family and friends from Iran, and they were all moving to this one town called Great Neck. And fast forward to this day, it is, I'm pretty sure, one of the most largely populated Persian Jewish cities in the US. And so that is where I grew up. That's my culture. Those were my surroundings. And I'm very happy and proud to say that. And so I grew up here. I went to public school. And I was raised in the public school system, which is a really good system here in Great Neck. And so post going through the school system, I went to yeshiva for a semester. I went to a Jewish environments. I took a gap semester and went to Israel. And I went there for a semester. And after doing that, I went straight to Binghamton in the spring. And since being in that environment, there's so much Jewish life. I'm pretty sure 33% of the school population is Jewish. And so in that environment, I was very lucky to have a part in many Jewish organizations, Chabad, Maor, Hillel, Buzo, obviously. And so just coming from my environment, coming to a place where not everyone is Persian, which was a new environment for me, funnily enough. I thought that was very cool, and I thought I was very lucky to be able to go somewhere where I had my own unique type of personality, type of place where I came from, type of culture. And so I think I'm very lucky to have come from the place I come from. I'm very happy that I was influenced by a lot of Persian culture, which does relate a lot to Jewish culture. But to have that fusion, I think, was really healthy for me. And so that's my environment. I'm still currently a student at Binghamton University, studying on. I'm on a pre-dental track, and yeah, so that's where I came from, where I went to school, and where I'm at now.
Thank you for sharing, Eden, and sharing your family's and your community's story. We'll now go to Manashe, who will share his story and the Bukharian Jewish story. It looks like Manashe froze. So while we wait for him to come back, I can actually share my community's story and the Kavkazi Jewish story while we wait for him to come back. So for those who don't know me, my name is David, as I said earlier. I'm with Camera on Campus, and I'm from the Kavkazi Mountain Jewish community. So a little about myself. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, to Kavkazi Jewish parents on both sides. I grew up in Queens and also lived in Staten Island. Before moving down to North Carolina and going to college in West Virginia. I'm actually wearing my alma mater shirt today, and part of why I'm wearing it is because I find some humor in being a mountain Jew, and I went to a school whose mascot is the Mountaineer, so I'm a mountain Jew who's a mountaineer. So, you know, sometimes fate brings people together, and I love that about my experience in college. So I went to West Virginia University, and my parents immigrated to the United States and to Israel from the former Soviet Union. They particularly grew up in the Caucasus, which is why the Kavkazi community is called the Mountain Jewish community. Particularly my mother's side is mostly from Dagestan, which is inside the Russian Federation, particularly from the city of Derbent. My father's side also has a lot of people from Dagestan and Derbent, but also people from Kabardino-Balkaria in the city of Nalchik. And we're the Jews of the Caucasus, along with the Georgian Jewish community, which is also from the Caucasus in Georgia. But they're a different community. Hopefully for another day, we can share their story. But why I'm really excited to share my community's story and my community's connection to Israel, my own connection to Israel, is because the Kavkazi Jewish community is unique. Kavkazi Jews are an intersection of Russian-speaking Jews and Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. We're Mizrahi because we tie our Mizrahi and Sephardi because we tie our roots to Persia after leaving the land of Israel. We even have a language that's fused between Farsi and ancient Hebrew called Juhuri. And we settled in the Caucasus, in Dagestan, in Kabardino-Balkaria, in Chechnya, and also in Azerbaijan. For those of you who've heard of the Kavkazi community, you've probably heard more about the Kavkazi community in Azerbaijan, particularly in places like Krasnaya Sloboda, in Baku, and some other places as well. So it's unique for me not only to represent the Kavkazi community, but to represent the other side of the Kavkazi community in Dagestan. And my parents had left the Soviet Union at different times. My father's side left in the 70s and bounced around a little bit, going to Israel, and then eventually to Brooklyn. And then my mother's side mostly went to Israel, and then my mother immigrated to the United States to marry my father. I have a sister who's in pharmacy school right now, and I like to joke that she's the only Kavkazi Jew in her pharmacy school. She's actually one of the only Jews in her pharmacy school. It's a small school. And I used to joke I was the only Kavkazi Jew who went to West Virginia, but then I learned there were a few other Kavkazi Jews who went to West Virginia, which is quite unique. But I'm really excited to share our story. I'm really excited to share the connections our three communities have. And I'm really excited to have the chance to also talk about Jerusalem, Israel, and connect with our audience. I know we have students from Binghamton. I know we have students from Clark University as well, and a few other great campuses across the East Coast and hopefully also the West Coast. For now, I'll leave it at that. I'd like to pass it on to Manashe, who will speak about his story and the Bukharian story. And then when we go to question and answers, I'll have a chance to elaborate more about the Kavkazi story.
Wow, wow, wow. What a fascinating thing. Don't want to repeat most of what we said, but Bukharian Jewish community trace back their connection to Israel from the destruction of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE. So if we're talking about all of these communities, the Persian community, Kavkazi and Bukharian community, for the vast majority of the period of time, all of these three communities, we were all part of the same community. And we lived during the different times of the Persian community. So I'm a Bukharian Jew. I was born and raised in Samarkand. I came to America at the age of 14. And my father's side, they all were born and raised in Samarkand. However, if I look at my mom's side, her one side of it comes from Iran and comes from Afghanistan and Kavkaz. So I have that side of a family. And then on the father's side, paternal side, we even have people coming all the way from Syria. So I always say that if you learn about Bukharian Jewish journey or Bukharian Jews in general, you simultaneously learn about history of other Jewish people. Because we lived in Central Asia and we got there during the time when the Persian king created parts of the Silk Road. And Samarkand is the city where it was the middle of the Silk Road, is the middle of all the biggest artery of the Silk Road that was connected. So that's why I always say that also, if you look at 10 Bukharian people standing in one line, they all will look different. They all will look from different parts of the world, is because we got connected and opened very cosmopolitan community, very cosmopolitan people. A little bit about myself. Like I said, we immigrated to the United States in 2001 when I was 14. Came here with my parents and two of my sisters. What excites me about sharing the story about Bukharian Jews, like I said, if you're learning about Bukharian Jews, you learn about Jewish history in general, but also is because Persian Jews and Bukharian Jews, these are the two communities that identify themselves by the empires they lived in, rather than by the countries they're coming from. So that's another interesting thing. And Kavkazi Jews, it's like we're having this Persian, and I think that's how we actually started. We started with the Persian representative, then went into Kavkaz, and then we were going eastward to the Central Asia. But we speak Bukharian language, which is a mixture of Hebrew, Farsi, a dialogue of Farsi, and Aramaic, a little bit of Urdu and Pushtun. So when I hear and speak Bukharian, or I hear other people speaking those other languages, for some strange reason, I understand them. And the connection to Israel for Jewish people, for the Bukharian Jews, was always there. And I'm willing to talk a little bit more about it later on with all the questions. But Bukharian Jewish people were connected to Israel, and always went to study to Israel, and it was always on the front line of our mind.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing, Manashe. And now that we had a chance to hear about all three of our communities, we'll help facilitate the conversation and make it more interactive with all of our participants by starting off with a few moderated questions from Eden, who will ask both me and Manashe each a question, and then I'll ask Eden a question as well. And then we'll spend the rest of our event having questions from you, the audience. So while Eden is asking us some questions, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box or on Facebook Live. We love questions. We're the Jewish community, whether we're Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, we're an inquisitive people. So please feel free to submit questions throughout the event.
Great, thank you for passing it off, David. So my first question I will ask is, Bukharian and Kavkazi Jews both have the distinction of being Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews from the former Soviet Union. How has this dual perspective and narrative impacted you growing up? And I guess we'll start with David and then move to Manashe afterwards.
Fantastic question, Eden. I think that's a really great question. For me personally, growing up in New York, I always knew I was Kavkazi, but I used to joke with people in a few other events that I've done with camera and our students. I used to think there are only three types of Jews growing up in New York, in Brooklyn and Queens. So there are Bukharian Jews, Kavkazi Jews, and Russian-speaking Jews. I thought all Jews spoke Russian, and it came from some part of the former Soviet Empire. I mean, it's very easy to do that when you grow up in New York. But when I moved to North Carolina, so you can imagine I came into quite a culture shock when I discovered not only were there no Bukharians or Kavkazi Jews in North Carolina, most Jews in North Carolina did not speak Russian. So for me, growing up with that kind of dual experience, a huge Jewish community in New York, a huge former Soviet community in New York, and then a smaller Jewish community in North Carolina, there was a time in my life where I did feel it was easier to just identify as a Russian Jew because, as I'm sure some people who are from smaller states could attest, explaining to somebody your identity sometimes is not super easy if they've never heard of the Caucasus, if they've never heard of Central Asia, if they don't even really know where Russia might be on a map. So as a kid and as a teenager, once I moved to North Carolina, it was very easy to kind of conflate the two identities just because, it was like the too long didn't read version of who I am. But when I went to college, I really started blending the two communities, the two experiences. It's unique in this country to be Sephardic and Mizrahi as it is. Most American Jews come from Eastern or Central Europe, from Ashkenazi descent. Just on itself, being Sephardi and being Mizrahi is very unique in itself, but also having that former Soviet Union angle and connecting those two experiences while I was a college student really, I think, helped define me as a person. Going to college, I was involved with Chabad. I was the president of Chabad for a few years. I was in AEPI. I was very much involved with a lot of the Jewish communities, but I didn't really have a chance to truly kind of explore my own ancestry until I went to APAC one year to policy conference, and I heard the American ambassador, the Azerbaijani ambassador to the United States, Ilan Suleymanov, speak and talk about the connection between Azerbaijan and Israel. And then that's when I really started digging in more into my community and started really asking my parents all these sorts of random questions about where are we from? Why are we different than Russian-speaking Jews? Like, who are we? Like, what are we? What's our history, our culture? Learning more about it. Of course, I always grew up with Kavkazi cuisine. There is a meme I saw going around a few days ago when people ask, what's your favorite shows? And, you hear about Curb Your Enthusiasm or Seinfeld, the typical American Ashkenazi experience. And this meme said, when you're Sephardic and you eat stuffed grape leaves and you've never watched Seinfeld. And it's a picture of Larry David just staring, like confused and befuzzled. So, a lot of great Kavkazi food growing up, chubareki, kurze, dolma, a lot of amazing foods that I grew up with that subconsciously defined my culture, but I didn't really start to take self-ownership of both the Russian-speaking angle and the Kavkazi angle until the end of college and then as a young professional. And something that I really like to do now is kind of blend the two and connect them to other Sephardi and Mizrahi experiences as well, and promoting the Russian Jewish perspective as well. It's important to hear from all Jewish voices, and that includes my own community. So that's kind of my perspective, kind of growing up as a first-generation American, these confusing identities that most Americans have never heard of, and kind of bring them together.
Great question. So to me, that's an interesting thing. I always say that in Russian, there is a saying, "Чужой среди своих," which means that you are foreigner next to your own. And I think being a Bukharian Jew, that's exactly how I feel all the time. And I'll give you an example. So we are from Central Asia. So whenever in American terminology, you talk about Asian Jews, what do you imagine? You're not imagining a Mizrahi Jew. You're imagining a Jew from China, right? Maybe from India, but it's very, very rare. So when you're thinking about Russian Jew, I don't really fit in there either. I just fit in with the language. And then when you talk about Mizrahim or Persian Jews, but I speak Russian, that throws people off. On top of that, within the Jewish organization or Jewish institution realm, when there is funding is given for RSJ community, for Russian-speaking Jewish community, usually Bukharians get left out in that. We kind of get part of it, but it's usually always like, oh, but it's more geared towards the Russian-speaking from those communities. Yeah, it's also for you, but not really. So it's always that kind of thing. And then whenever there is studies about Middle Eastern Jews and Jews of North Africa, you know, and sometimes Iran is still there, but then Central Asia is still not part of it. So I'll put it this way: we've been living in the outskirts of the land for the vast majority of our time, and I think the idea of fitting in is not really working and won't be able to work. So through literature and like references, I'm connected more with Russian Jews than with Persian Jews, right? And I'm connected more with Kavkazi Jews than with Persian Jews. But if I go to synagogue, I'm connected more with Persian and Kavkazi Jews than with Russian Jews. So I think that's an interesting piece about it. So if you're like an observant Jew, then you have more the Mizrahi part is where you be able to fit in much easier. But once you start talking about references about like David, you talk about Seinfeld and all that stuff, right? We're talking about Nupagadi, or we're talking about Snigurich, all of these different references that I could say, and you see David is like getting excited about it because I understand what I'm talking about, and Eden is like, what the hell is this guy talking about? That's exactly what I'm trying to say. And if we had a couple RSJ Russian-speaking Jews here, they probably would be more connected with that. So I think Bukharian Jews were in a perfect position because that identity, I always called myself Mr. International, right? I always be able to kind of be a floater. In Israel, I'm Israeli. In other places, I could go for it, and people think I'm Muslim. I was in Turkey. I had to convince a Turkish guy that I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Jew. He's like, no way, you're a Muslim guy. Come eat with me, inshallah. And he was like bringing me in. So like in Europe, like I always have to convince people that I'm who I am, and always people connect me with them. Turkish people think that I'm Turkish. Italian think that I'm Italian. Israelis, they like speak to me in Hebrew all the time. I'm like, I don't really know Hebrew. Like, leave me alone. Especially in the summer, my hair gets curled up and things like that. I get a little tense. So I think being in the middle of the Central Asia really puts me in this position of like, you want to do stuff about diversity. I think I'm pretty good way of Bukharian people are set in an interesting position where they could understand all of these different communities at the same time, just because where we grew up, just because where we lived, and what we got exposed to.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Manashe. And I really like the contrast between our communities, because that's always something that I always felt like there are some things I can have more in common with Persian Jews, but some things, like you said, more in common with maybe Russian-speaking Jews or Bukharian Jews, and sometimes feeling kind of in place with everyone and out of place with everyone. And to kind of add to that contrast even more, a question that I've been thinking of asking you, Eden, because obviously the Persian Jewish dynamic, not only just from where our families come from, but even within American and Israeli society is a little different. I know this part of Persian Jewish history is different for everyone, but I was wondering if you could talk more about your family's experience coming to America, if the Iranian Revolution in the 70s impacted your family directly or indirectly, and just hearing more about that dynamic. Because while Manashe and I come from a former Soviet Union perspective, dealing with communism, Iran obviously dealt with a lot of different things with the Islamic Republic coming up, and most Persian Jews coming to the United States and Israel.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a great question, because it was kind of a halt in the thriving Persian Jewish life in Iran when that happened in '79, when that big revolution occurred. So both my parents. So my dad left about like 7 or 8 years prior to the revolution. As I said prior, he went to France to study in university. So he missed that part of it. And then from France, he went to the US. So he actually missed even the years leading up to it. My mom, on the other hand, in the years leading up to the revolution, she and the rest of my family were very lucky. They got out pretty smoothly. And in my experience with other Persian Jews, they seem to have a similar experience, as in like when you hear like the word revolution, you do a lot of times hear like leaving like illegally or leaving through borders or having to escape. Honestly, that's not something I've heard so much throughout my life in regards to the Persian Revolution. My grandma, who came from Yazd, she was really like one of the only people that that she had to leave kind of in this movie scene scenario, because the people at Yazd, some of them were, it was pretty harsh for the Jews at Yazd, and so around 79, she had to leave. I guess it wasn't as peaceful, and she had to leave through various borders. She couldn't leave directly from Iran, whereas most Persian Jews could. And so that was the experience of leaving Iran. Most of my family, most Jews did leave Iran. There's still a handful, I think about 20,000 that are still there. But in the way that the revolution kind of shaped my parents' viewpoint and then ultimately my viewpoint, I think is very interesting, because they don't look on it. They don't look back at their life in Iran, I guess, in a harsh lens. It's not something that they try to forget about. It's not something that like they try to place in the back of their minds and move on. They very much identify with their culture. Like I think Persian Jews versus other Sephardi Jews. I think Persian Jews, maybe the most, they bring in their non-Jewish culture into the house, into the community, and I think that's healthy, because there were a lot of great things that they took from the Persian community in regards to family, in regards to academia, in regards to a lot of that, and so it's funny because like when I like me growing up in the U.S., if I were to experience something of that nature, I think I would look back with pain, with a similar emotion like that. But my parents, they look back at their time in Iran, and it's very interesting. They like had such an amazing time. They had amazing friends. It was beautiful. They don't stop talking about how beautiful the country was, how it had all different types of environments, how if you want to take a drive up to, I don't know, this place, you could see the mountains. This place you could see the snow. This place it could be warm. And they frequently spoke about how the Persians in Iran were very warm. And if you go there now, it's the same way. Persians are a very, very warm culture. And so I think that kind of that was very interesting for me, because growing up, I didn't have like this bad image of Iran. And it's very interesting because when like other people, when I tell other people I'm Persian, I come from Iran, they'll give me a face. And like, it's funny because I never had that like depiction of Iran until recently, until when I got older and started watching the news, and I started hearing about the government there now and how they do what they do. But growing up, Iran was like a fantasy land, really. And it was a place that it's funny because like the way Jews look towards Israel, it seemed like Persians look toward Iran. And so I think that's kind of like a unique thing that like Persians hold to themselves, that they kind of have like two motherlands, and they really look at both very dearly. So that was kind of my shaping throughout my childhood in regards to that question.
Amazing. That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's always amazing to hear the diversity of experiences within the Persian Jewish community and how their families processed it. I know the same is also true probably in both of our communities for me and Manashe too. You know, I know some of my family have different views on the former Soviet Union and Dagestan, and then other people in my family are more nostalgic. And it's interesting to hear that from the Persian Jewish perspective as well. And I think, like Manashe said earlier, I think it's important to have this contrast. I think it's good to see kind of how we blend together, and also how the shades, you know, differ a little bit as we, you know, branch out further into the diasporic history of our three communities. So in a second, I'll turn it back over to you, Eden, for Q&A from the audience. But while we wait for more people to submit questions, I do want to turn back to the title of our event for a second. The reason we chose today, a few days before Yom Yerushalayim, is because when we were talking with Buzo, the Israel Club in Binghamton that's co-sponsoring this event with us, they mentioned that the holiday was coming up and it'd be great to incorporate it into our event. So a question I want to ask for all of us to answer, and Manashe can go first, and then Eden, and then I can go afterwards, is, what direct, deep ties do our communities have to the city of Jerusalem, to the holy city of Jerusalem, which of course is one of the most important cities in Judaism, but also for other religions as well, and connecting it to Jerusalem. I know Manashe talked about it a little bit already, the connection to the land of Israel, and then also the connection to the state of Israel. So if we could just touch upon all of those topics, but especially the Jerusalem aspect.
Great question. So there's a lot of this conversation that's happening where Bukharian Jewish community, right, we were part of that exile with the rest of the Jewish community that ended up in Babylon. And when the Cyrus the Great comes in, the Persian king comes in and allows Jewish people to go back to rebuild the second temple, my ancestors now went back. So is probably David and Eden yours. And we ended up and we stayed within this Persian empire for the vast majority of its history until the kingdom starts splitting, and that's how the Kavkazi became Kavkazi Jews, Persian Jews, or Mizrahi Jews, or versus the Isfahani Jews and Bukharian Jews, and then many other different kind of sects started to creating. However, the Bukharian Jews were going to Jerusalem throughout the history, throughout the whole history. So over all this time period, there were evidence of Bukharian Jewish people coming to Israel and going back. And I give you a couple examples. For example, number one, we know that because of last names, right? We have a last name called Plishtiev, which comes from a root of Palestine, right? Philistine. So usually in the Bukharian community, you give people nicknames, or you give them you'll give last names because of their nicknames. So we have my mom's ancestors, my great grandmother, she's Rochel Ironi. Why Ironi? She came from Iran, right? So because having those last names allows us to understand that there was that connection. Another interesting factor is the Bukharian Jewish quarter, okay? So the World Zionist Organization, their first meeting happened when? Do you guys remember? 1897, right? So that's the first meeting. However, the Bukharian community was going to Israel and had not just visiting, but had an organized structure to taking Jews to Jerusalem to build a Bukharian Jewish quarter, started in 1830, up until 1890, when the actual Bukharian Jewish quarter in Shchunat Bukhari, it was created and was built. They even have a house built by Yagudaya family for Mashiach. Okay, so we could say that these Bukharian Jews were like the first Haredi type, like Orthodox Zionist people that would go to Israel because it's the land of Israel and establish and build a land there. So we're talking about pre-Zionist organizational, like structural piece that the Bukharian community felt that they need to organize within themselves, move, build a structure, create a community. And there's also evidence out there, right, that we purchased the land. And that kind of goes against all of those other narratives that we hear usually from the Western media and from the from the other side of the where they talk about the European coming, taking from Arabs the land and establishing the country. So there's proof that the Bukharian Jewish community came and they purchased. Therefore, it shows that it's not quite happened the way the media portrays about Israel. So I think those two kind of pieces, and there's more, but those two pieces kind of show us the commitment to Israel, the understanding to Israel, and knowing that that's their place, and Jerusalem in particular. And I think one last piece I want to add, I usually take young professionals to Uzbekistan We do like a heritage trip. We'll have Bukharians, Persians, a lot of Persians join that trip. We all also some Ashkenazim that want to participate. The coolest thing ever is when you stand in the middle of Bukhara, which is a city in Uzbekistan, and you have a woman, a Muslim woman, convincing you and telling you that all Jews that live in Uzbekistan, they all went to Israel. And I said, no, we from New York. This is a group from New York. She says, no, you're lying. All Jews belong in Israel, and therefore you live in Israel. So you came here from Israel. You didn't come from America. So it was the first time in my life where I had to stand and confront a Muslim woman with her family and argue that, no, I'm from America, not from Israel, and not all Jews live in Israel. And she was convinced absolutely that Jews belong in Israel, and that's your land, and that's where you come from. So don't give me BS that you're coming from America. That's it. So I think that shows and tells something that people on that side of the world that is not really influenced by media and all these other narratives really know where Jewish people come from, because the influence doesn't really get them as much. So I think these three pieces kind of shape the answer of connection to Jerusalem, I think. Okay.
Yeah. No, I think that's very interesting. I think that's a very unique type of background to come from. And so in regards to the Persian community and their mentality towards Israel, I think it is very, very interesting, because if I recall correctly, most Persians post the revolution, most of them moved to the U.S. You had them moving to the East Coast or the West Coast, but you had like a small community that did move to Israel. Most of them settle in Holon, if I'm not mistaken. That is a large Persian community. That's where I have family personally. But for me, I can't really speak about that community per se, just because I was born here in the U.S. And so that's really the viewpoint that I can speak about. And so in regards to that mentality, like growing up, Israel was always a huge part of our lives. It's funny because growing up, we never knew much about Israel. Like my parents, at least in my family, we didn't know much about Israel. We didn't know much about the government, about the social policy, about the politics. We didn't know much about it, and I didn't travel to Israel until I was a freshman in high school. But it's funny because like whenever we heard the word Israel, like everyone became quiet, like everyone tuned in, everyone like there was a certain aura of the word that would produce this like feeling. And so growing up, like we had many parades in our town for the Israel Day Parade. It was a very popular Persian thing to go to Jerusalem to celebrate one's bar mitzvah. That was a very popular thing. And so growing up, the feeling and the aura was always something tantamount, I think. And so like even in shul, like after services in synagogue, in my shul particularly, they used to sing Hatikva right after shul, and like I thought that was normal growing up until I started going to other shuls, and I realized that's just not what they do in other shuls. And so like just to add on to that point, like whenever I started traveling to Jerusalem, to Israel, and I started becoming more passionate about that society, I used to ask my parents, like, why are we not moving to Israel? Like that's where the Jews should be, you know? And they would always give me like, I don't know, like, no, like this is like, it would be difficult, it would be so and so. And so that's when I kind of learned, I don't know, like there's like I think Persians, they like their environment in the US. I feel like it would be hard to put them in a small country. I don't know, that's just my own personal take. I feel like Persians just like big, like give me 5 acres of land, whatever. Like that's I feel like that's a common thing among the Persian community. And so I feel like living there wasn't necessarily always a goal of theirs. but the feeling was always there. The traveling was always there. Like going there in the summers was there. But yeah, in regards to actually going and living there, was never really much of a possibility. I do want to change that for myself eventually, but yeah. So I guess just to summarize, like there's a passion, I guess, with the Persian community towards Israel, towards Jerusalem, which I think kind of like translated to their kids, giving them like, even them, they have, like, even me, I have this passionate feeling, and that was even prior to traveling to Israel, prior to learning anything about it. So I thought that was very interesting and very indicative of the Persian community.
Amazing. Thank you both for sharing. Eden, it's funny, I had like the opposite upbringing. Like, I used to joke with people growing up, I don't think my family ever had to worry about me loving Israel because we always talked about Israel. But for me, like, my connection to America actually developed after my connection to Israel, even though I grew up in the United States. Of course, growing up in New York during 9/11 impacted how I viewed America and felt more American after that. But growing up as a child, I remember going to the Israel Day Parade with my dad. It was one of my first visible memories of Israel. And my dad would tell me how, like, when I was young, he watched the 1996 Israeli elections until like very late into the evening. So my family kind of had the opposite dynamic. The politics, the culture, everything was just, you know, like Israel, Israel, Israel. And it was amazing growing up in such a passionate Zionist family. And as I got older, I was wondering, like, I noticed not all American Jewish upbringings were like that. So why is the Kavkazi experience, at least for my family, why are we so connected? And then I started doing research, and then I started kind of learning more about my own community. I know in Azerbaijan, there's a town called Krasnaya Sloboda. It's one of the, I think it is the only, outside of Israel and outside of small places, you know, like Kiryas Joel in upstate New York, it's one of the last remaining all Jewish towns. It's all mostly Kavkazi Jews, all Jews. And it's called the Jerusalem of the Caucasus. Going off Manashe's story, how you have like Muslims who are like, oh, you're all from Israel, you all live in Israel. I joke with people, I wonder where they get that impression from, that we're from Israel when you call Krasnaya Sloboda the Jerusalem of the Caucasus. And I know in Derbent, there have been some comparisons as well to that, because Krasnaya Sloboda for Azerbaijani Kavkazi Jews was the center of religious and spiritual life. In Dagestan, it was Derbent that was one of the main centers of religious and spiritual life. And some other things I just kind of want to cover when it comes to Kavkazi Jews in Jerusalem and in the state of Israel and the land of Israel is Jerusalem always comes up. I always hear it in passing in my family amongst, you know, other Kavkazi community members. There was a documentary that came out a few months ago by a Kavkazi radio host in New York City. I can't remember his name at the moment, but he started off part of the clip talking about Jerusalem and talking about how it's like not only the breath for Kavkazi Jews, but for all Jews. So that connection to Jerusalem runs very deep. And similar to other Sephardic and Mizrahi communities, a lot of the connection to Jerusalem and to the state of Israel is very much religious and steeped in tradition. And I think it's particularly fascinating because Azerbaijan and Dagestan and Chechnya, all these places have different narratives within the Kavkazi community. I always like to joke, it's like being tribal within tribal. You know, people would argue, oh, I'm from Derbent, you're from Baku, you're Krasnaya Sloboda, I'm from Nalchik, all these debates over these different towns, but and different levels of religiosity. Azerbaijan is more of a history of Zionism, is more of a history of religious connection. Dagestan was more secular. And actually during the Soviet period, a lot of Kavkazi Jews in Dagestan and in Kabardino-Balkaria would secularize themselves. So people would think that we were a different ethnic group in the area called the Tats. And that's how Kavkazi Jews protected themselves in some parts of the region, but the connection to Israel and the Jewish tradition was always there. The Kavkazi story of how we wound up in the Kavkaz was orally passed down from family to family. I know other communities have more written tradition, but for our community it was more orally and verbally passed. But one story I like to specifically reference when talking about Jerusalem and Israel is the former chief rabbi of Derbent, Yaakov Yitzhaki. He moved to the land of Israel, as many Jews would do. They make aliyah I was reading part of a new book released by Svetlana Danielova, who writes a lot about Kavkazi Jews, and I know she's partnered up with Bukharian authors in the past as well to talk about the two communities. And she mentioned, I always knew that Kavkazi Jews had been making Aliyah since the late 19th century. Well, I was just reading right before this event actually started even earlier, in the early 19th century. And that's amazing to think, way before modern Zionism, Kavkazi Jews were making their way back home to Israel, to Jerusalem. And there are different places in Jerusalem that have little presences of Kavkazi Jewish culture, not as strong as the Bukharian presence, but definitely you can see that there's a lot of Kavkazi presence in the area, and it extends to Zionism as well. I know a lot of times we talk about kind of the differences between the Ashkenazi and the Mizrahi and Sephardi experiences, but I like to think, and I think history shows too, there sometimes where we overlap as well. For example, I know a lot of the detractors of Israel will bring up that the Zionist movement was predominantly Ashkenazi, white colonial settler state. And my favorite thing to point to and say that's not true is Kuti Adam, who is Kavkazi from Dagestan. He was in the Haganah, and he rose up through the IDF once Israel was reestablished, and he was supposed to become a Mossad director. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in the 80s before he could take office, but that just shows you the diversity of the Zionist movement as well. In Baku, in Krasnaya Sloboda, you had a strong, vibrant Zionist movement. You had Zionist newspapers. Of course, in Azerbaijan, you also have Ashkenazi Jews and Georgian Jews as well. So there was an interconnection of the communities there. And I think these things are all important to bring together, because the Kavkazi experience and the Kavkazi community prides ourselves on being so connected to our Jewish roots, so connected to our Jewish history, whether we're religious, whether we're secular. It binds the Kavkazi community together, whether one's from Nalchik or Derbent, and how much people want to fight over their, where they're from, specifically from the Kavkazi. Our history and our future binds us together. And something else that I always like to point out, anyone who's watched, I know we have some students who've been on other Mizrahi events where I've spoken, know that I like to bring up the tradition of amazing Israeli singers who are Kavkazi. I won't start with the most famous one, I'll finish with her, but I'll start with Jaffa Yarcony. People may not know who she is. She was, for a long time, a singer who would sing to the IDF. Very similar how in America we would have singers sing on USO tours in Iraq and Afghanistan for our troops. Jaffa Yarcony would sing to IDF audiences, and she was Kavkazi. Then, of course, Sarid Haddad is Kavkazi as well. And Omer Adam is half Kavkazi, half Ashkenazi. So we have a strong history of amazing Israeli music. And I know both the Bukharian and Persian communities also have a strong representation in the arts and music as well. I know for the Persian community, immediately Rita is the first one I think that comes to a lot of people's minds. And I always like to bring in the cultural element, because to me, some people focus more on the Zionist element of their community. Some people focus more on the religious, some people focus more on the cultural, but I think it all blends together and there's space for all of it. So I'll leave it there, and we'll take some more questions from the audience. I think we got some in the chat, Ed, and it looks like people got lost on their way to the Q&A button. I think they're putting it into the chat box instead.
So while you're reading it, just want to point out, since this is like a normal Mizrahi thing to do, who has more people in where apparently I found out that Gidon Saar has Bukharian roots, by the way. So maybe there's a chance they will have a Bukharian prime minister one day, and see what happens with that. So, and Mea Adumim, Ma'ale Adumim has a Persian mayor that actually came to New York, and we did a beautiful program for him at Queens College Hillel, and lots of Persian students were excited to see him. So, and the question that I asked him, I said, what do you think if we have a Mizrahi prime minister, do you think things will change in Israel? He says, I think we'll get to the peace much faster if we have Mizrahi person. I don't know if it's objective or subjective, just throwing it out there.
That's really funny that you bring that up. I was just thinking, for those who know who Rabbi Eli Abadi is, he's in the UAE now. He's a Syrian Jewish rabbi in New York. I was watching an interview he did with Mark Golub on JBS from a few years ago, and he said the same thing, that if the Mizrahi Jews were involved in the process earlier, there would have been Middle East peace earlier. So it's a joke that for sure I've heard in other parts of the Sephardi Mizrahi world as well. And my own family were bringing up Gideon Zar's Bukharian ancestry as well. So, you know, these conversations, they happen across communities, and it's amazing. And actually, before we go into the other questions, I was telling Douglas, one of our staff helping us with tech right before the event, how I discovered the Bukharian Quarter when I was in Jerusalem 2 years ago with Northeastern University's Hillel. I bumped into it just randomly, didn't know it was there, and I joked, "Where's the Kavkazi Quarter?" So it's amazing, though. It's absolutely amazing when you go through Jerusalem. I mean, it just shows the connection between the diaspora, the land, the state, each of our communities, the diversity, the strength of our communities. I just wanted to share that story. It's always a favorite of mine. You know, it really got me interested more into learning more about Jerusalem after seeing that.
That is so funny. Yeah, I actually have heard that before. And listen, I think there is some truth to the concept. I guess just coming from that environment. But okay. Cool. So we don't have much time left. I do want to finish off with one last question for both you guys that I think kind of relates well to, I guess, to a different age scheme. And so the question is as follows. What's it like as a member of the Jewish communities that are not represented on Jewish life on campus? So like I guess how I took the question is like, how does it feel growing up in your town with your Jewish community? And I guess going to college, like what things were new? What things did you miss? That's how I took the question, and that would be a creative way to answer, I think. So we'll start with Manashe, and then we'll go to David afterwards.
So just to reiterate your question, growing up in one way, going to college campus, and now see that you won't be able to fit in?
Yeah, I guess like going to college, what was different about Jewish life there, coming from your home background?
Good question. So I think I went to Baruch College, and I think Baruch is so diverse. It's in New York City, that I didn't feel that I had to like talk about my Bukharian identity, because when I was president of Hillel there, my vice president was Iraqi Jew, another vice president was Russian, Ukrainian, another one was like Syrian. So it was such a diverse group of people that we never thought about differentiating or connecting, and it was such a beautiful environment. However, when I left that place and I wanted to find it somewhere else around it, I couldn't find that. It was always, you have to be one way or the other. There was always these different type of buckets. And unfortunately, lots of students that I work with feel exactly the same way, especially during the pandemic. They felt abandoned, that there's not so many organizations know how to deal with Mizrahi and Sephardic people. There's a lot of organizations that pivot their vision and only focus on what they know instead of focusing on like new engagement of different programs and diversity stuff. And that's where actually an organization was born, SAMI, which is Sephardic American Mizrahi Initiative. This is the organization that I have started with a couple of advisory board, and that's one of the reasons was, what if we could partner beyond college campuses and focus on Sephardic and Mizrahi students while they go to 4 years of their college, and when they graduate, to connect them back to their communities. You know, if you're Persian, connect them to the Persian community, Bukharian to Bukharian, Kavkazi to Kavkazi. So then that will continue in going, and we're trying to do that. I hope next year we'll be able to have a conversation and I could share about the successes. But so far, we see that people attending, they're coming and they're interested. We're doing stuff over Zoom. And there's going to be a big summit in July. And maybe Camera on campus will partner with us, and we'll bring in more Sephardim and Mizrahi people on this conference. So.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing, Manashe. And I think for me, my experience is a bit different. As you can imagine, going to West Virginia University as a Jewish person in general, it's been an interesting experience. There were a few other Sephardi Mizrahi voices. There was somebody who I believe was also Kavkazi, involved with Chabad, and there was also like random like Georgian Israelis coming in and out of campus. I remember like 2 or 3, but most of the Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews I met at West Virginia were non-Americans, which is not, it makes sense outside of New York and LA and Miami. and Seattle, of course, most American Jews are Ashkenazi. So I learned a ton about the Ashkenazi Jewish experience, but I think I also learned a lot about the Sephardi Mizrahi experience from the few voices that I did meet from the Mizrahi and Sephardi space. One of my fraternity brothers was a foreign exchange student from France, and his family are Sephardi Mizrahi, and learned a ton from him. And I saw visibility for that conversation increase on my campus when he came to campus, and that helped me talk more about it as well. But it was great learning more about not only the Ashkenazi Jewish experience. Something that I learned a lot about is the experience of Jews in America who come from small towns. And from West Virginia, I met Jews who are actually from West Virginia, not just going to school in West Virginia, actually grew up in West Virginia, not just like the bigger towns like Charleston or Morgantown, but also places like Williamston, West Virginia, or Dunbar, West Virginia, and really small places that most of our audience almost certainly has never heard of. And then I explored the experiences of Jews on campuses in other places too, like in North Carolina, where I went to high school, places like Alabama and Tennessee, places where you wouldn't expect to see Jews in general. So for me, like I said, North Carolina was kind of like a shrinking violet. I felt uncomfortable in my Jewish identity because I went from New York to North Carolina. But I think going from North Carolina to West Virginia with an even smaller Jewish community, it forced me to double down in my own identity. And of course, at West Virginia, I had so many amazing mentors, the Chabad Rabbi and Rebbitzin, Zalman and Hindi Gurevitz. I mean, without them, I don't know what my Jewish experience would have looked like in college. We were small but mighty. We had amazing Shabbat dinners, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Israeli, American Jews, just so many different people you wouldn't expect to see at West Virginia. And we punched above our weight, is what I like to say at West Virginia. When we went to the Chabad Shabbatons, we were the smallest delegation usually, and we were the loudest delegation. And I think that's really defined me as a Jew. It's defined me as a Zionist, and it's defined me within my own community's experience. Being small in number doesn't mean you can't have fun, and it doesn't mean you can't live a meaningful Jewish life. I know it's not always easy being Jewish on campuses like West Virginia or Kentucky, where there aren't many Jews, especially if you come from a minority within a minority within a minority. If you're Sephardi, Mizrahi, Ethiopian, and coming into those campuses as well, it's not the easiest experience, but I think it's a chance to showcase who you are and be a representative for your community and kind of grab leadership for yourself and grab visibility, because that's how I felt like my college experience was. I unintentionally grabbed leadership. It wasn't something I was looking to do, but it definitely was something I wound up doing. And then also connecting it a little bit to the young professional experience for me. I think I really blossomed as a Kavkazi Jew when I moved to Boston and worked before camera, but especially camera too, when I worked at the Boston Federation. I know Cheryl Aronson is watching, and I just wanted to give her a shout out, and also to Matt Leibovic, two people who really inspired me to embrace my identity as a Kavkazi Jew and get more involved in the Sephardi and Mizrahi space. And then I want to give an even bigger thank you to Camera on Campus, particularly our team, Aviva, Hallie, Zach, Sasha, Douglas, who have helped me as a professional inspire and empower our students to speak about their own Sephardic and Mizrahi stories. So I think the college connects to the young professional, because something that people don't always think about is, we inspire students in college, whether we're a student leader like Eden, whether we're professionals like Manashe and myself, but then sometimes I think there's a drop off after college. So I hope one thing that people can take away from this conversation, whether they're Bukharian or Kavkazi or Persian or Ashkenazi or Ethiopian or whatever other background there is, because the Jewish tent is so diverse, is that you can find inspiration anywhere. I know for me, I talked about this with other young Kavkazi activists who are starting to come up through the pipeline. Some of the people who inspired me were Bukharians and Persians, because they're the two closest communities to my experience and also Russian Jewish experiences. And I saw activists from those communities grab leadership head on, and it inspired me to try and do the same thing and do the same thing for students as well. Awesome. I think we're almost out of time, but I do want everyone to just have a chance to kind of give closing thoughts. I kind of gave mine, so I'll let Manashe or Eden speak next. Just some closing thoughts before we close out what has been, I think, a really great event.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's really funny, honestly. I guess like take like that difference between going from New York to a place like West Virginia is like such a high drop off. But I thought it was interesting how going from a place with even a smaller Jewish community afterwards kind of like forced you to like establish yourself, which is very interesting. So I guess what I just want to close off with is I guess like growing up, I was surrounded by Persians my whole life. When I did learn about other types of Jews, my first reaction, and I don't feel proud saying this, my first reaction was like, oh, I thought Persians were the only types of Jews. Like like I thought like my whole life was Persian this, Persian that, Iranian that, and Persians have very strong pride within themselves. So so I'm not proud of saying that, but that was kind of my reaction in high school and in college and whatever. But I guess as I got older and as I traveled more and as I actually spoke to other types of Jews, I kind of like developed this like a more positive reaction, I think. Because whereas my first reaction was kind of defensive, my second reaction was kind of like offensive in regards to like offensive and like creating like a plan, like creating a diversity, like, okay, we have different ideas, different viewpoints, different cultures, and like how can we combine that rather than divide? And so I think that's a big message we can take home for ourselves is I guess rather than look for differences, those are great because there are very healthy differences that people should take to heart. I think we should try to interact more with other communities, try to, I guess, bring this culture and that culture and fuse it. And with that, you can create a new concept that's going to be unique. That's going to help more people. And so I think that's something that I learned in my, I guess, growing up and in my college experience. And I guess that's just what I want to leave you guys with.
Amazing. Wow. So something that comes to my mind is actually the process of immigration, of coming to America, right? There is a big idea of let's become as American as possible in the early days when Jewish people arrived to the shore of United States. And that was kind of norm. Doesn't matter if you're Poland Jew, Hungarian Jew, Russian Jew, Spanish Jew, you need to be American. When the Soviet Union collapsed and lots of Russian Jews start coming in, there was this idea of peoplehood, of like creating this groups of people, but like let's kind of be part of the same, but have your like integrating into larger society. But then later on, this whole idea of a mosaic of Jewish people, right? That every Jew is different, and then if you put each pieces into this one beautiful mosaic, and now you have a beautiful picture. Which with all of those pieces, I don't really agree with anymore. Which probably before I probably would look at them, because I think the most healthy way to do it is first of all integrating into the society, because you don't have to leave anything behind of yours, but you could be part of something while bringing something of your own. Because if you know who you are, what's your narrative, where you come from, you will stand much better on both feet instead of just being on one of your legs. And the last thing, the way I think we should start looking at the Jewish community today in America or in the United States or in New York in particular, is we should look at the Jewish community as a pomegranate. And the reason why I'm saying pomegranate, because not because of 613 mitzvot, but because if you look at it, there are seeds, right? Every seed looking to different directions, and there are divisions between them. And we need to realize that it's okay to be different. It's okay to have those different communities. It's okay to have Persians and Syrians and Bukharians and Kavkazi having their own communities, as long as we try to create bridges and we try to have an opportunity for them interact with this large American Jewish machine. So if we have that, then we create unity without uniformity. And I think that's something that we sometimes forget of, like, let's just all become American Jews. And that's when people feel like, I feel left out. But if we have saying, be a Persian Jew, but have a representative, so then we could have access to you and you could have access to us. And I think that's what I want to leave people at. Let's together build a Pomegranate society rather than any other societies that we've been trying to build thus far.
Amazing. It's amazing hearing all of these closing thoughts and the different takeaways we've all had, you know, in our lives and our communities have had in their experiences. I think it's a perfect way to end this event. I know there are some questions that are now starting to come in. If you do still want your questions answered, you can email me at david@camera.org, and I'll make sure to pass along your questions to Eden and Manashe, and if they're for me, I'll answer them as well. But I do want to close out the event after what I think was a fantastic event. It didn't even feel like we're on a panel. It felt like just a normal conversation. I think that's perfect in a world where everything is so overstructured on Zoom, that we had a chance to just kind of have these conversations and talk about these different topics. But before we do go, I want to thank, of course, Camera on Campus and Sammy, which is Manashe's organization, for co-sponsoring. I want to thank Buzo for co-sponsoring as well. And the great work that Buzo students and Eden did in planning this event. And I want to also thank Eden himself for you know, being able to plan this event. It's not easy being a student activist, yet alone during a pandemic when we're all online. And you know, I know for me personally, I prefer being in person, but if we're not in person, this is a great way to do it. Thank you for your leadership, Eden. Thank you for your leadership, Manashe. And I want to thank everyone for attending today's event. And I hope you have a great evening.